Welcome to the Directions 2011 interview, and thank you very much to Tim Jackson and to Matthew Taylor for sparing the time to talk with us this afternoon. Our challenge today and the discussion that we're going to have is based on the concept of choice and the possibility that less choice could be good for consumers. The concept of choice goes right to the heart of so many of the issues of today's society. It seems to me that even since I was born, it's been absolutely positioned as a constant, a thing we have to strive for. It has been one of those things that pretty much since the end of the Second World War, as Western economies developed and moved into more prosperous, stabilised economies, it has been positioned as a virtue that we need to be aiming for. It wraps up a whole variety of issues that Tim and Matthew know quite a lot about. It's significant in the areas of economics, of psychology, of sociology, marketing, investment, politics, the role of government, our relationship with business and our relationship with profit. The bigger picture of history and, as we now know, current affairs, if we look at the recent riots in the UK that the French have so nicely called the shopping riots. So Tim and Matthew, you've both touched on aspects of these in recent interventions. Tim at your TED Talk, Matthew in your annual speech, actually. If I can start with you, Tim. You said recently, we buy things we don't need with money we haven't got to make impressions that don't last on people we don't care about. That seems to me to be a pretty good place to start the conversation.
It's a very, cute little aphorism that attempts to capture the sense in which we're all actually, in the name of consumer choice, caught in a kind of trap of continual debt, continual spending, continual display, continual social engagement that leads at the end of the day to quite perverse behaviours. Perverse in the sense that we find ourselves in debt, deeply in debt in some cases. Perverse in the sense that we consume stuff we don't need. Perverse in the sense that it actually isn't in our best interest sometimes to literally cash out all our social relationships in material terms. So it's a kind of trap. And I don't think I'm saying abandon the idea of choice. I think it's rather a critique of the proposition that more choice is always a good thing. Actually, choice is a much more nuanced thing. We choose some things into existence, and in the process of choosing them into existence, we choose others out of existence. One person's choice is another person's prison. The ability to choose unethical investment, just to mention one of the things you said, actually makes ethical investment very, very difficult for ordinary people to choose because it skews the capital markets and it changes the balance between private rewards and public risks.
I think we need to unpack this issue of choice. There's a huge number of dimensions to it. I mean, it is true that there is some research that shows that actually choice makes people unhappy in the sense that if people are faced with choosing between 50 jams and 4 jams, the experience of choosing between 4 jams is less stressful because you don't have the sense you're missing out on so much in the choice that you make. So there's a very specific issue there about whether or not choice works. The choice mechanisms are not simply about the experience that you have when you make the choice. The theory of choice is also that, in a way, your choice is a benevolent act because as you choose, you improve the market and you improve the choices available to other people. So we have to understand that choice is both about that immediate experience, but also a theory about how it is you drive improvement in systems.
I agree a lot that it's not a question of demonizing choice, that there are not just good things about choice, but actually a theoretical framing in which those good things appear, as Matthew says. And I also agree that a part of the problem of choice is that we have cognitive frailties, that we don't make good choices. That there are social frailties in the way that we exercise choice, but there are also frailties that come from the structures of power. And it is quite often the case, I would argue, that the context of choice is determined by existing power structures, by existing interests.
There's a link here, Nigel, between your question about the role of government and Tim's point about how it is, as it were, we overcome those cognitive frailties which lead us to make systematically unwise choices. And that's where this concept of nudging comes in, of course. And the point there is, how is it we change the habitual context which leads us to make unwise choices? And we argue here at the RSA, we use the concept of steer, which is that nudge is a rather paternalistic idea, which is I will change what's called your choice architecture. So for example, classically, I'll make you have to reach further for the unhealthy food than you have to reach for the healthy food in the staff canteen. That's a classic kind of nudge technique. But slightly paternalistic, slightly sinister in some ways. The idea of steer is that you work with people for them to understand the habitual nature of their behaviours in order that they can change their own choice architecture. So the interesting idea here, I think, which will grow in the 21st century, is that as we become aware of our cognitive frailties, we also start to learn how it is we need to reshape the context so that we're more likely to make good choices. And that's a new role for government.
I don't think it quite answers what I was challenging you with a little bit, which is that the architecture of choice has a power dynamic associated with it. So that there are, in the context of choice, we externalize certain risks, certain costs to others. The social cost of slave labor, the environmental cost of resource extraction, the public risk associated with underwriting risky financial practice in the capital markets. Those are externalizations which undermine the ability of people to make ethical choices.
This idea about the business role and how they can change their models and their relationships with us as consumers. I mean, I look at the energy market in the UK, and there are organisations like E.ON who are actually doing some quite interesting things to re-engage, to re-educate. But how do you see the responsibility of brands, the public face of corporations and their interaction with us to educate us and change us in our behaviour?
Well, I think there are two sides to this. I think the first side is the negative side, and that's where companies need to recognise that our awareness of the kinds of issues that we've been talking about means that the myth that all that companies do is respond to real preferences has been exposed as the myth it always was. Companies shape preferences, choices shape preferences, they're not a response to preferences.
So the demand economy concept.
I was in Number 10 a few years ago, and we started talking to drinks companies and saying to them, you need to take responsibility for the outcome of the drink culture. And at that stage, they wanted nothing to do with it. I heard last year that I think Diageo actually gave the government its own information about how best to stop youth binge drinking, which, by the way, it's nothing to do with health or risk, but it's just saying if you drink too much, you make an arsehole of yourself. And that, if you look at all the campaigns now, that's what it's all about. It's all about the fact you will make yourself look stupid. So drink and food industries were the first to go. They were the first ones to have to say, we can no longer say it's nothing to do with us if people drink too much of our stuff or if they eat too much of our stuff and they get sick. Now the financial services sector has been pulled into that. So the negative side is that companies are increasingly having to take responsibility for the fact that they shape our choices. And if the choices they shape are bad choices, they're going to be held responsible. The upside of it is that people like shopping, they like brands. It's a positive engagement. They choose that engagement at some level. And so brands do offer an opportunity to work with people to encourage them to make wise choices.
Just coming back to one point that we've touched on a little bit, the whole idea of, and I don't like the expression, but I don't have a better one, the internalisation of externalities, which I think we mentioned there. I mean, is there an economic answer to this rather than the psychological, the sociological? Should we simply be paying more for the impact of these products?
Well, there is a conventional economic response, which is exactly that you should internalise those external costs in a monetary form. So there are real costs associated with the depletion of resources. There are real costs associated with the degradation of habitats. There are real costs associated with the loss of biodiversity. We're not very good at being able to put precise numbers on, but we know they're there. I'm not against that idea that you have to internalise and that actually that monetary internalisation works. I am against the idea that that's all that you need to do. And I am for various reasons, because it suggests that you keep the basic architecture of the economic system intact. And I think there are specific cases where that leads you actually into the wrong direction. So
I think that the debate we keep coming back to, and I think Tim and I have had this debate before, is that I think there are more and more consumer-facing companies now that recognise that things have to change and are genuinely committed to changing. And you're seeing really quite radical shifts in business models. But you've behind this got, as it were, the invisible men, and the invisible men is the investment community. And I think one of the big questions over the coming years is the way in which the corporate social responsibility debate moves into that space. Because I'm speaking to more and more business leaders, I'm sure you as well, Tim, who say, look, I get it, I want to change the model, but every 3 months I have to report on my profit situation, and I'm across the table from people who judge me through a computer program.
We're talking here about the top end of the financial industry, the Goldman Sachs of this world and the like, but it's also ourselves. Somebody said very interestingly last year when the BP incident happened, that happens because BP need to take risks to generate the returns that we, the UK pension owners, require in order to feather our nests for retirement. If we didn't require the type of pension that we're asking for, BP would not operate in that kind of way. It was the US government who made some of this argument, by the way. But there's just an interesting bit. It's about us and it's about the big investment banks.
I think up to a point that's right. It is about us. And certainly when it goes to the question of pensions, everybody wants security into their old age. I think there are two kind of important provisos, caveats, if you like. One is that actually quite often it's long-term security that suits pension funds best, and it's not being well delivered by capital markets. And the other is that actually it isn't everybody. It isn't everybody who has access to good long-term financial security. It isn't everybody who earns the profits from shareholder involvement in companies. There are socio-demographic differences between the profit takers and the wage earners, and they are creating real social tensions in a society in which profit is an increasing percentage of the national income and wages are a declining percentage of the national income.
But it is the case that, out there are people who will go to their coffee shop and buy the fair trade brand, and they will act in a whole set of ways which they think reflect their values. Meanwhile, their money is being invested in a way which is utterly contradictory to that.
I think the critics would argue nudge is great, improve people's knowledge to help them make better judgments and choices, and yet that won't go far enough. And what's actually needed is a more systemic economic model change.
Let me just start with the idea of nudge, because I think it's right that choice architecture is different. It's right that we have cognitive frailties. It's right that you can shift those cognitive frailties and sometimes remove them or even reverse them. A lot of the work that I do at the University of Surrey with my research group is around people with very strong intentions to behave in different ways. So intentional communities, they're sometimes called, or intentional households, people who have both strong moral values in pursuit of sustainability. They have a lot of time to dedicate to it. They make identifiable choices that ordinary people don't make, and sometimes they're even measurably happier because they do it. And that's a fantastic finding, because it sort of suggests you can choose the right things and be better off for it in all sorts of ways. But actually, it's not our primary finding from that research. Our primary finding from that research is how difficult it is, even for highly motivated individuals, to get out of their car, to choose a green energy supplier, to have ethical pensions.
The idea that nudge on its own solves much is ridiculous. The point is that if through nudging you start to create a demand and through other mechanisms you start to create a strength of lobbying, then you'll be in more of a position to get government to take forward structural change. So these strategies work together, and there is a lazy anti-statism around at the moment, which kind of says, the government can't do anything. It's all about what we do in communities, and that's complete nonsense. However, I do think the most effective government action, in my experience, is in response to community initiative, because government's more likely to get it right if we're pushing them to do it.
So let's maybe draw it to a close a little bit around the core concept of choice. Is it good for us? How do we influence it? What can we change to improve the choices that we make?
I'd say choose choice, but with no illusions. It's better to have a choice than no choice, but there are lots of choices we systematically get wrong. There are lots of choices where my more choice is your less choice, and there's lots of bounded choices where we are not really looking at the choice. We are being given a choice which has an impact in all sorts of other ways on the environment and other people, which we would not choose to have, but which is hidden from us. So I think the task is more choice, but choice in the context of an informed public aware of their own frailties and a more holistic view of, in the end, of the good life, really.
Tim?
I think I would do two things really. One I'd replace more choice with different choice, and the second thing I would do is to eliminate, probably prohibit, the conjunction of the word consumer with the word choice, because actually what we need to create quite clearly is citizen choice. And many of our choices as consumers conflict quite directly with our choices as citizens. And the one government action that I think is absolutely vital from our work on looking at just these structural obstacles to making citizen choices in favour of sustainability is around investment. We do not have investment structures, investment markets, investment conditions that are suitable to lay down the infrastructures for people to make different, better choices.
Tim, Matthew, thank you very much indeed for your time, and thank you especially to Matthew for the use of the RSA today. It's been a real pleasure being here, and it's been a really interesting conversation with you both. Thank you very much for participating in the Directions 11 interview, and thank you all for watching. I hope it's been interesting. It's certainly been enjoyable hearing these opinions. Thanks.